Hi, this is Curt, and welcome to another edition of Fire Law Roundup.
Here's what we've got. So this was really interesting. This story really is about another story. The story is about a journalistic article about failed investigations within the department. There were some allegations of sexual harassment and some other allegations, and they were investigated within the city. And after the investigation, the city concluded there was, nothing at fault. And then a private investigator was hired. Now, what I don't know is what caused that to happen, but a private investigator was paid $10,000, which is pretty fair, frankly, for an outside investigator to look into the complaint about the behavior. And the interviewer interviewed 20 or so members and concluded that the captain violated the city's sexual harassment and workplace violence or hostility policy. So the article isn't really focusing on the sexual harassment, although certainly talked about it. It's focused on why is there a different result. And you and I constantly talk about who should investigate. And look, let's be fair. You can't have somebody in rank and file who reports to the accuser do an investigation or the accused do the investigation. It's very hard to have the chief or somebody under the chief to do the investigation because the failures might have been of the chief or of one of the others under the chief. So really, it's one thing when you have a large city, you have an HR department, you can have somebody come in. I know you're a fan, you say all the time of internal investigations. But in this instance, they show the internal investigation didn't work well or maybe produced a different result. And look, we're assuming the outside investigator was even right, but nonetheless, you got different results. Right. So it kind of goes to my point in a smaller department. Now, this is a city, right? But still in a smaller department, you almost have no choice but to go outside. How do you do it inside?
And you know what? This is, to me, this is why I love the practice of law. Okay, because you and I can disagree over this and we're still friends. In the firehouse, sometimes when you disagree with somebody, you're like mortal enemies,
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I take a different tact, and I kind of prejudice my take on it by basically saying that I don't think outsiders should be investigating firefighters. It's like I don't know enough about how an aircraft carrier works that if I'm going to do an investigation into something that's happening on a naval aircraft carrier, I don't understand the culture, or even worse, a submarine, where there's a culture in there. I've never had to live in a submarine. I've never had to go under the ocean, under the ice cap, and be several hundred feet down. And one little problem, so I don't know the pressures that are on the people that are doing that. Somebody who is familiar with that should be doing the investigation. That's my only point. Now, I agree with you. There are, especially in smaller departments, there may not be someone who is not personally conflicted on it. And that's a good reason to go outside. But I really think to expect that some attorney, some person with a JD who might do a real estate closing, a divorce, an eviction, and then they're going to do an investigation into a firefighter, give me a break.
It's interesting. I just had a conference this weekend. We had 80 or so people, and we talked about investigations. We, of course, talked about our show, and hopefully people are watching. Hello, if you are. But, one of the things I said is I wouldn't hire an attorney. I mean, it's one thing, you and I, we do these kind of things, right, as a normal course, but that's kind of rare. Most attorneys don't do investigations. And frankly, I said, look, if you can find a retired state trooper or a detective, an investigator, somebody who knows how to not only ask the questions and do the investigation in the right order, but also to record it properly, document it properly. Yeah. But I guess I would retort to your comment. And by the way, let me say, I love disagreeing. Right? We learn, we know,
we're
taught
to do that. We're taught to disagree, and it's okay. It's okay to disagree.
Look, I think ignorance is not listening to the other side, right? That's the issue. So we get enlightened. But I think that there is a standard of conduct which is acceptable or not acceptable in any environment. And one of the problems in the fire service is, right, we have a skewed standard of what's acceptable or not. And sometimes it does take an outsider to come in and say, this environment is toxic. This environment has lost its way because look what's on TV, or listen to the jokes, or look at these pranks, right? And it seems to become accepted.
But there's two points to that, and one is you and I have talked, and I'm in a graduate program at Arizona State University in forensic psychology, and one of the classes I've already taken, I think you and I have talked about this, is the positive psychology class.
Super interesting. Super interesting.
Okay, and one of the points that I took from that class, and the professor didn't say this out, you know, make the connection of the fire service. I made it, especially with my TA. Who was grading the papers and doing the different things. But there's a treatment that is part of positive psychology called humor therapy. And there's a number of different things. It's good for anxiety. It's good for depression. It's particularly good for PTSD. Okay, it's if there was one thing that humor therapy can address, it's PTSD. Okay, so now, guess what's been part of fire service culture going back at least 100 years, maybe longer. And it's not just here. I've met firefighters from Japan. I met a firefighter from Iran and North Korea when I was with the NFPA. You know, we're all the same. India, Australia. I mean, we're the same. But humor is in our culture. And someone who doesn't recognize that, and I think the average firefighter without any psychology training knows humor is part of our culture. Dark humor, gallows humor, but it's part of our culture, okay? But it's been like we've been self-medicating, okay? And I think it's healthy. And somebody who's not in our culture is not going to understand that. So that's sort of and we can disagree, put that on the shelf, okay? Yep. The other side of this has to do with the willingness of officers to report misconduct. And when the officers trust the process, they know they're going to get a fair shake, they're more likely to cooperate, and everyone's more likely to cooperate. On the other hand, when they feel like they're pushing one of their subordinates off the plank of the ship, they're more likely to try to cover it up. And what we want is a disciplinary system that the rank and file trust, not necessarily to let somebody off, but that they can trust, and it's going to be managed. Now, if you hire attorney A to do one investigation and they recommend somebody's going to be fired, and then you have another attorney does a very similar investigation and they recommend that just a reprimand, now we've got a consistency problem, and we can't control who is doing these. So I really think going outside should be the exception, not the rule, but there's a skill set that goes along with that.
And can that be the middle line? Because maybe the answer is, okay, not too outside and not too inside. So maybe the answer is, look, and I know this is so self-serving, but I feel that if you or I came in to investigate, and I do it all the time, or enough of time, right? We do. So we have that understanding of what's humorous. Now, some might say, okay, we're already warped, we're already skewed on what's acceptable in the firehouse. I don't think that's true, but I think there is a midline of there could be a good group of people who are outside, but not outside the fire service or outside the fire department or the EMS entity, whatever, but they're not outside the service. So maybe there's the middle line where you find common ground to say that's how an investigation should be done, because I do agree with you. I question whether it's right, but I do agree with you that somebody on the outside doesn't understand our culture. On the other hand, does that make it legally acceptable, right? If our culture is so improper that that's just accepted, is that acceptable?
Yeah, and I think we can determine that after we have a certain complaint about whatever it may be. Issue A, we have an investigation and we deal with it. And now we have another one, and now we have another one, now we have another one. At some point there may be a need to get an objective set of eyes on that problem. Why is this continuing to happen?
Right.
Okay. But I think there's an awful lot at stake here. And the defect that I see here is that we have a reluctance to deal with discipline. It offends our culture. And one of the reasons is that we're concerned. Like if you and I are firefighters together, and we've worked, and just like I have with so many of my really good friends who may be listening, and we worked as colleagues, same station, we might vacation together. The kids do things together. They are in Little League or they're whatever. And now I've got to report you knowing that it's not going to happen.
Right.
They've got to trust the system. We have to have a system. This is not unlike what law enforcement went through, and that led to the development of the professional standards concept. Right. And professional standards I don't think is going to work if most of the investigations are done by somebody outside the organization, because the people will not trust it, and consistency will be a problem.
You know, it gives me an idea as we talk. And again, we're all still talking about the journal and the first article here, right? Which is about investigations. But it gives me the thought of, could a department, I don't know whether it would match all the laws, but could a department create an internal, confidential stage 1 investigation proceeding where things can be reported and investigated and corrected internally? And the reason I like that is because remember what you and I just talked about last week or the week before, where I said, okay, somebody comes to you and says, I don't want to report this. I'm just telling you about sexual harassment, but I don't want to do anything about it. If there was that kind of middle ground where it was confidential, would be dealt with properly, but not publicly, it would stop the conduct. Maybe more people would come forward. Maybe they'd come forward sooner. Maybe more people would trust the process. And I would call that like a stage 1 grievance procedure, right?
Well, and I would just say that's how we should handle anything. Now, there are certain types of investigations that could lead to termination, that could involve criminal conduct. Those have to be handled in a different manner. But again, you know, what I teach in my discipline class is sort of an overall process. That starts with, we want to have someone in the organization that's the point person, not the fire chief. So we're talking about usually a 4-bugle deputy chief, but they don't do the investigations necessarily. They sort of quarterback it. And the complaints go to this person. That person then makes the decision on, number 1, are we going to investigate it? Number 2, how are we going to investigate it? Is it going to be formal, informal? We're going to take recorded statements. Are we just going to ask for written statements and all that? And by doing that, it's centralized so that you're not getting a lot of inconsistency with that. Okay. Right. And then the third and the most important one that I think addresses your concerns is who is going to. And so there may be circumstances where we need to go outside. I don't mean that we never go outside. There are certain circumstances we need to, but you want to make sure that someone who is involved in the allegations, somebody's going to be a witness, certainly somebody's accused, okay? Right. But at the same time, we don't want the victim doing the investigation. No. And that kind of ties back into this, because it seems like Casper had some procedures that said that when someone makes a complaint about sexual harassment, it will be investigated. Well, guess what? Who is going to do the investigation? It doesn't say. Right. Okay. It doesn't say a battalion chief. It doesn't say a deputy chief. It doesn't say we're going to have a chief of professional standards that then is going to make the determination, so that we don't have somebody who's got a stake in the outcome involved in doing the investigation. So we really want that quarterback there, the chief of professional standards, to be in the position of overseeing it, assigning the investigators, making sure the progress is moving along, and so on. So obviously I feel passionate about it. Okay. And I think, and I didn't invent it. I know the person who invented it. A guy who was a captain in the Los Angeles City Police Department after Rodney King. And it developed out of there in response to the Rodney King incident. And it was a recognition that law enforcement was struggling to deal with. How did Rodney King happen? It happened because officers were looking the other way at other misconduct, that their culture was stronger than their overall big picture obligation. and that the department was ignoring complaints about this very behavior. So again, a lot of the things that we see, I don't want to belabor that, but
right. No.
you know,
And I'll just make my
it's
two final points and kind of, we'll move on. But, one is everyone should remember the point of investigation is not necessarily to determine anything. It's to determine the facts, right? Get the facts. The conclusions are a different issue. The investigator determines the facts. So there shouldn't be, I mean, yes, you can definitely have fact investigation biases, right? No question, but, who you believe what. But if you just put down the facts, let somebody else determine what's true or not, is one of the things. And, the other part is I kind of look at it like a doctor shouldn't give injections to their child, right? To their own child, because, and this is
a lawyer shouldn't do wills for his family members.
Yeah, kind of, but you shouldn't create harm. Well, it's not the bias issue. It's, you don't want to cause pain. You don't want the parent causing pain to the child.
Right.
And to me, it's kind of the same thing. The assistant chief investigating, one of his captains or firefighters is kind of difficult because I'm the disciplinarian, which you are as a chief, period. But now I'm investigating something sensitive. And then we go out on the fire ground, right? And it's a trust issue. So I kind of, but that's easy in a big department. That's not easy in a small department. But I don't disagree with you. I think that we just got to find a way in the fire service and start giving a uniform way for these investigations to handle. I do agree outsiders aren't necessarily the best people to do it.